Thank you to the Bank Inter Foundation for Innovation for the invitation to join here. As explained, I'm a little bit of an oddity because I'm a marine scientist talking about water. But why is that an oddity if 95% of water is actually in the ocean? So that means that our thinking process is a little bit awkward. So water was presented as a problem. In my opinion, it's not a problem, it's a gift. And it's actually a gift from outer space. So 80% of the water in our planet actually comes from outer space. When planet Earth cooled, there was only about 20% of the volume of water that we have today in the biosphere, and the remaining 80% has been contributed from space materials that are being gifted to planet Earth. And it's not only a gift, but it's also a common good, and therefore we need to stop thinking about water being owned by individuals, by countries, and by nations, and think of it as a common good. So the fact that water can be owned is already water beyond past the bridge. So I'm going to have a high-level conversation, only like 10 or 12 slides, about how use of water on land affects oceans. And then I'd like to maybe reverse the question at the end of our conversation as to how ocean can actually alleviate problems on land that were touched upon by David earlier. But basically, I'll start with this cartoon that is a summary of the water cycle and the water budget of the planet Earth, where obviously oceans is 95% of liquid water. And as you can see, through evaporation, water fuels, the ocean fuels the water cycle. So everything that rains, that moves through the ocean, through the landscapes, actually comes from the ocean. So it will be impossible and awkward to have a conversation about water without talking about oceans. It will be the big elephant on the room. But there's far more than water that drains from land into the ocean. So when fresh water enters the ocean, it affects ocean physical properties, density, salinity is affected by freshwater inputs. That in turn affects ocean circulation and even affects ocean bathymetry because fresh water entering the ocean comes loaded with particle sediments that deposit in deltaic areas and change the seafloor elevation. It also affects ocean chemistry. Even the salinity of the ocean comes from salts that are delivered from land. So the ocean chemistry is also in close interaction with the flow of water from land, affects ocean productivity, and affects fisheries and food production from ocean. So it's not just water that comes from land to ocean, but all of those properties and all of those effects. In fact, we continue to, after a few years where this issue was removed from our media, now we start seeing again, probably with the rise of far-right thinking in politics in Europe and elsewhere, this notion again resurfaced that rivers entering the ocean is a waste of water and a nonsense. In fact, the driver that picked me from the airport yesterday was also issuing the same type of opinion, that why do we continue to allow water from entering the ocean from rivers? It's a waste. We're wasting water by allowing it to flow into the ocean, where it actually affects all of these properties. So the interaction between humans and through water use and oceans was radically changed in the late 1800s, where Philadelphia built the first modern sewer system, and that delivered sewage water that used to be just thrown into the streets of Philadelphia, now into Delaware Bay, and really affected Delaware Bay in profound ways. This is not really the first time that a sewer system is built, but it's probably credited to be the first modern sewer system. The first large sewer system was in the city of Rome about 2,000 years ago, and it was called Cloaca Maxima, the outlet that collected all of the sewer water into the Tiber River. And in fact, you can still see the Cloaca Maxima when you go to Rome. So it's a long history of sewers, but the first modern sewer was in Philadelphia, and it changed everything. So the consequences of delivering our sewage from urban areas and also agricultural areas impacting on water chemistry and water quality into the ocean were the proliferation of algal blooms and what is called eutrophication, an excess input of organic carbon and nutrients into the ocean, leading to the proliferation of dead zones around the coastal waters of mostly of the global north, but also in Asia. And then also that was compounded by harmful algal blooms that produce toxins that also make seafood unavailable to humans. So we've seen a proliferation of these dead zones around the ocean due to sewage input and also excess input of fertilizer from agricultural fields, really having deep, deep effects on the ocean that are very difficult to revert. So we had an unplanned experiment with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, where the Soviet Union or Russia were providing industrial fertilizer to many of the countries in the communist bloc, and then the disruption of the Soviet Union stopped that input of fertilizers to many nations, and we saw major improvements within a few years in the health status of the Black Sea, or even in the Caribbean in Cuba, where fertilizer applications stopped, and also in some of the Baltic states. So that was a clear indication that if we are to control a runoff of nutrients from agricultural soils through excess application of industrial fertilizer into the ocean, we can really improve water quality. But many of these problems are difficult to reverse, so there's a stage shift transition to a dead zone that has its own internal mechanisms that perpetuate this situation. So in the Baltic Sea, Baltic states have been already trying to reverse the hypoxia or the loss of oxygen in the Baltic Sea for several decades, and they have only partially succeeded. So it's a hysterical cycle, a process called hysteresis, where it's very easy to drive the coastal areas into becoming dead zones, but very difficult to undo the damage. So the best thing is to avoid it. And still, despite our understanding of how use of water by people in urban areas, but also agricultural areas, impact on aquatic ecosystems and ocean ecosystems is already very mature, we still see very low levels of water treatment and even very low, much lower levels of reuse, as discussed earlier. So reuse is still very, very low across even the most advanced nations. And even water treatment, it is shocking to think that the city of Brussels, that is kind of the political capital of Europe, was still discharging raw sewage into the river down to 2010. So only a decade ago, then started to implement sewage treatment, which is not fully implemented even in Europe. So we're still doing very poorly in water treatment and reuse at the global scale. So there's a lot of path to go forward to improve on these statistics and really have a global stewardship of water quality and water use. But also, along with, we focused on organic materials that come from sewage and also fertilizer that comes from the Haber-Bosch reaction and application of industrial fertilizer to agricultural fields. But really, the waters that we discharge into the ocean come loaded with a cocktail of all kinds of compounds: cocaine, caffeine, hormones from steroids. Everything goes down the ocean, even a lot of synthetic fibers coming from the washing of our clothes in laundry machines. All of that ends up in the ocean, along with heavy metals and legacy pollutants. So that really has huge impacts on marine life. And therefore, it's not just about nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic carbon. It's also about this cocktail of chemicals that we discharge into the ocean. And for instance, we have evidence of marine life being heavily disrupted by loads of caffeine that enter the ocean, and even issues of reproductive success and gender change induced by hormones that are discharged into waters. And for instance, many of those particles are actually also pathogenic particles, like viruses that come, enteric viruses and bacteria that come from human diseases into the ocean, where they can be accumulated by filter feeders and again get back into human consumers. So many problems of water quality that we need to address before water is discharged into the ocean, but also the volumes of water that is being discharged are actually decreasing due to appropriation of water by humans that is no longer reaching the ocean. So humans appropriate of an estimated 8,000 cubic kilometers of water per year, which is approximately 1 in every 5 liters that used to be discharged in the ocean is now co-opted by humans. We have also built large reservoirs that also impact on not only the delivery of water, but also the sediments that are transported from land to ocean and are now retained behind reservoirs. And reservoirs actually contribute to global evaporation, so they are net negative in terms of water, and they reduce also the flow of water to ocean. But it is very important to realize that 95% of that appropriation of water is actually used by agriculture, and the bulk of that is used for meat production. So that is what we really have a problem and also an opportunity in terms of improving our stewardship of water. And on top of that, increasing use of water, then we have a problem that's aggravated by climate change that is leading to a reduction in the stored water in lakes, rivers, and reservoirs, whereby more than 50% of lakes and reservoirs have already lost volume. And we have also many lakes that have disappeared. For instance, the Aral Sea has already vanished, the Lake Chad in Africa is almost gone, and many lakes in semi-arid areas are gone. Even in Spain, the freshwater marshes of Doñana dried up last year, and they have been in very bad state for the last several years, and even other wetlands in Spain have dried up. So we have a problem of volumes and quality of water. In fact, I'm introduced as a marine scientist, but I was trained as a limnologist. So on the study of lakes, rivers, and so on, I published regularly on that, and I was once elected president of the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography. So I work on water from the atmosphere to the mountains to the ocean in an integrated manner. But the appropriation of water is now being reversed, and now we're starting to take water from ocean, as discussed by David. I think this is a fundamental development, desalination. And desalination is a fundamental development because in the area where I work and live, Saudi Arabia, we won't be able to sustain 35 million people without desalination. So there's really not enough water resources to support even perhaps 10% of that population. So it's a fundamental development in human history, desalination, and it is still a problem because of the high energy intensity of desalination, although, for instance, in the Red Sea Global, which is a new, very large tourism development in the Red Sea, we have the largest desalination plant powered by renewable energy, so then energy might not be a problem in terms of emissions that come from the desalination process. But still, we now return a new product to the ocean, which is brine. And why should brine be a problem if brine is, in principle, nothing else than what was in the water, then concentrated by a factor of 2, then they return back to the ocean. So that's in principle because in some desalination plants, then there are chemicals that are added to avoid scaling and accumulation of carbonates in the system. So those chemicals are also going down with the brine. But brine is a problem because if it's not properly diluted, then it affects flows of water, and the heavy brine water that's been discharged and sinks to the seafloor and then seals the seafloor from exchanging properties like oxygen with the water column, and it leads to mortality of marine organisms through hypoxia and also sulfide production. So the problem with brine return is a problem of dilution, and in many desalination plants, they have been very poorly planned in terms of how the brines return to ocean and creating problems and impacts on marine life. Also, the concentrated salts include nutrients, so if not properly diluted, they can also be a vector of algal blooms. But brine discharge is now seen also as an opportunity. Some years ago, we ran a global challenge called Brains for Brines, where we challenge engineering schools around the world to come with solutions what to do with brine to avoid discharging brine into the ocean. They came with some creative ideas, but none of them could be implemented, or if implemented, they only solve the problem with a very small proportion or scale. But recently there was, in my opinion, the first development of a technology that actually allowed brine to be used at scale, and that is that actually came by serendipity. So it's a technology developed by a company called Partana in the US that was founded by Rick Fox, that is a former champion of NBA, LA Lakers and Boston Celtics. So he decided, he is Bahamian and was impacted by Hurricane Dorian destroying about 15,000 homes in Bahamas and destroying about 100% of the GDP of the country in 2 hours. And countless of people lost their lives. So he created first hurricane relief, a climate relief organization, but then he thought that relief in pain was not enough. He needed to work on solutions. So he started a climate tech company that produces climate positive concrete. But because he was doing this in the Bahamas, where they lacked materials, then somehow they figured out how to use brine to formulate concrete, and 40% of the volume of the concrete comes from brine. So they didn't do that in purpose to solve the problem of brine, but it's the first technology, to the best of my knowledge, that is able to embody brine at scale and actually embodies brine into the built environment. So that's an interesting proposition and a new development in desalination, to couple desalination to reuse of brine at scale. But one of the problems we encounter with water also is not only that the volumes are decreasing, but also that the reliability of flows is being jeopardized, and that's because precipitation rates are being skewed by climate change. So we have either too little or too much, rather than have a normal average. And for instance, these two news are from Brazil, within less than 1 year different from one to another. So last year, for some reason, the media didn't really pick up on the very strong significance of that, but the Amazon reached a record low level, 7 meters below the normal. And in fact, in some areas of the Amazon was no longer flowing. So it was disrupted as a river. There was mortality of river dolphins that were trapped in these areas. And then a few months later, then we have floods all over Brazil. And in fact, even in the European Union, Spain, and around the world, then either droughts or floods have actually reduced food production and crop yields by about 30%. So now we're coping with also an insecurity, not only in terms of access to water, but in terms of the timing of when water is going to become available. And that is going to create huge shocks to the global food system at a time where it's already under severe stress. So what can we do to overcome this situation? So I would like to end with this thought, and it is that we are talking about water and food production as being something that it's only met on land, but in fact industrial aquaculture is already producing 20% of food production at almost zero use of fresh water. So now we have an untapped resource of food production that's actually healthy for people, and healthy for budgets, because it really alleviates a lot of burdens on public health systems because of the health benefits of seafood. So we can produce food at scale from ocean with a zero water footprint. And why are we not doing that? So what in our mindset is preventing us from thinking on how to best integrate food systems on land and ocean? So food from ocean also comes with the lowest carbon footprint of any food. Some of them is even climate positive, like seaweed. So why is it that we are not integrating these food systems on water and ocean in a smart way? So that's why I chose in the word cloud before, my choice of word was smart, because we need to be smart about how we use water, and then go away from the mental blocks that we have, that we only think on land or ocean as separate entities. We need to integrate a use of the biosphere, and a use of the biosphere in a way that is regenerative. So I will leave you with this thought, but I calculated some years ago, like 2009, I published a paper where I asked the question of whether the ocean could feed humanity, and I calculated that if we just displace the water-intensive component of our diet, which is animal food, from land to ocean, we can actually double the amount of food that we can produce, and we can reduce greatly the impacts of food production on the planet. Thank you.